During the Second World War, the skies of Europe were transformed into a battleground. Here, some of history's deadliest episodes of airborne conflict were played out. At times, the air pulsed to the roar of hundreds of machines at a time. The names of the most fearsome of these flying machines remain iconic, even today. British Spitfires, American Mustangs, Japanese Zeros. All of these infamous machines earned their reputation as fiercely effective machines of war. And what a reputation it was. Pilots of modern-day fighting aircraft are rightly revered. We look up to them for their impeccable physical fitness, honed reflexes, and understated bravery. But pilots of this era needed all that and more. As we will soon see, pilots who got into the cockpit of a Second World War plane were more than just brave. Often piloting planes that utilized primitive or outdated technology, these airmen exposed their bodies to incredible forces and risked their lives in impossible circumstances. Of all such planes, it's perhaps the Junkers Ju-87 that deserves the reputation as the most terrifying to pilot. In today's episode of Wars of the World, we'll be taking a deep dive into one of the Second World War's most famous and feared aircraft, the Junkers Ju-87. Simultaneously, like some birds of prey, they fall upon their victim and release their load of bombs on the target. Everything becomes blended together, along with the howling sirens of the Stukas in their dives. The bombs whistle and crack and burst. That is a quote from Sergeant Prumers, a soldier in Germany's 1st Panzer Division, written in May 1940. At the moment he entered that into his diary, he was stationed with German forces fighting during the Battle of France, waiting to strike westward across the Meuse River and into the heart of France itself. The German air attack went like clockwork. Luftwaffe historian William Murray, describing the event that unfolded on that day, wrote, quote, "Continuous Stuka attacks on French reservists holding the line had a devastating effect. France's infantrymen, according to a French general who witnessed the scene, quote, cowered in their trenches, dazed by the crash of bombs and the shriek of dive bombers." The dive bomber in question, well, that was the Ju-87, also known as the Stuka. The bridgehead across the Meuse was secure by nightfall. German tanks crossed the next day. The blitzkrieg into France was on. Paris would fall within a month. This was not the Ju-87's first successful operation in World War II, nor would it be the last. You may already be familiar with the Ju-87. This dive bomber, with its larger-than-life reputation, became infamous for its terrifying siren, striking fear into the hearts of those unfortunate enough to hear it shrieking towards them. We included this air-splitting scream on our list of the most terrifying sounds of the Second World War. If you're interested, you can find that video on the channel. But there was more that was exceptional to the Ju-87 than its siren. A fearsome close-range dive bomber, the Ju-87 was fundamental to the Nazi blitzkrieg warfare. It was employed to startling effect from 1939 to 1941 and has an extensive operational history. It fought countless battles at land and sea across Europe during the war, terrorizing individuals from the USSR in the east, Spain in the west, and Norway in the north. Easily the most famous German ground attack aircraft of the Second World War, the Ju-87 was much more than just an effective fighting vehicle. It was the icon of the Luftwaffe. With its wailing sirens and whistling bombs, it became the symbol of blitzkrieg warfare. The gravity-defying dives it could pull off were feared by its own pilots, who regularly lost their vision and fell unconscious while flying. Outdated even before the beginning of the war, This plane was a beast to pilot, almost as feared by its own men as it was terrifying to those it attacks. Firstly, we must consider the very reputation of this plane, because it really cannot be overstated. The Junkers Ju-87 was not a German dive bomber, it was the German dive bomber. People everywhere called the plane the Stuka, an abbreviation of Stutzkampfflugzeug, the German word meaning dive bombing aircraft. I think now would be as good a time as any to apologise for my butchering of the beautiful German language. I will continue to call the plane the Stuka or the Ju-87 moving forward. However, calling the Ju-87 a Stuka is really like calling the P-51 the fighter or the B-17 the bomber. Regardless, such is the notoriety of the Ju-87, all who hear the word Stuka know that it is the Ju-87 being referred to. With around 6,000 built across the course of the war, not far off 1 in 10 of all fighting aircraft built by Nazi Germany, the Ju-87 certainly had the numbers to justify monopolizing the title of Stuka. But it was more than just numbers that cemented the Ju-87 into the minds of the German public and military forces across Europe. Even to a passionate aircraft fan like myself, the appearance of the Ju-87 is undeniably ugly. With hard lines and jutting components, the Stuka earned itself the nickname Flying Swastika for its angularity and somewhat brutal appearance. One notable feature of the Ju-87 is its unique inverted gull wing shape, making it easily recognisable, even from a distance. It was beloved by schoolboys across Germany. There was some practical benefit to the Stuka's ungainly appearance too. The straightforwardness of the design made repair and maintenance easy. The angular parts of the plane could be mass-produced in factories across Germany, all at a low price. This factor, in part, explains the long-lasting fielding of this rather crude aircraft, a significant point which we'll come to later. Now let's consider the tactical niche of the dive bomber. The one thing that set it apart from other aircraft. Traditional bombers maintain a high altitude, practicing horizontal bombing with aid bomb sights. These calculate the flight path of bombs dropped and must consider a variety of factors, such as altitude, bomb size, wind speed, and flight velocity. As a result, they tend to be somewhat inaccurate. Regular bombers are great for big, immobile targets like cities, where they can stay in the relative safety of high-altitude flight paths, raining death from above. They are, however, less good for situations demanding pinpoint accuracy, such as an evolving combat situation between two opposing forces. This is where the dive bomber comes in. Its purpose is to perform targeted, accurate bombing, often in combat situations, dropping bombs not from a horizontal trajectory, but a vertical one. Dive bombers can be far more deliberate about where their bombs fall. They rely not on the advanced computations of bomb sights, but on the human eye. Point the aeroplane at the target, drop the bomb, and pull out. Simple and devastating. The key point to all of this was that verticality. If the pilot could get the plane directly above a target, aiming became easy. Verticality had another key advantage: safety during bombing runs. It allowed pilots to get from a high to low altitude in the shortest space of time. Given the number of anti-aircraft guns, fighters, and other defensive capabilities often present on the field of battle, all of which are most effective at low-flying targets, this factor was vital. This is where the Ju-87 stands out. That's because the Stuka was the king of verticality. On this point, you need not take my word. Famed British pilot Eric Brown, the most decorated naval pilot in British history, flew the Junkers Ju-87 dive bomber while conducting tests of enemy equipment. Across the war, this man flew every category of Royal Navy and RAF plane, as well as most of the comparisons built and fielded by the other combatants. Fighters, heavy bombers, airliners, amphibian boats and gliders, Eric flew them all. When new advances in technology made jet engine-powered aircraft possible, it was Eric who was called up to try and fly these experimental, often dangerous machines. Clearly, if one person was fit to judge the capacity of a fighting plane, it was Eric Brown. He said this of the Stuka: "I had flown a lot of dive bombers, and it's the only one you can dive truly vertically. Sometimes with the dive bombers, maximum dive is usually in the order of 60 degrees. When flying the Stuka, because it's all automatic, you're really flying vertically. The Stuka was in a class of its own." He wasn't wrong. When the Germans came to test the plane at their facilities in Dessau, they were surprised by what they found. It was not the limits of the Ju-87 that had to be found, but the limits of the human body. That's because the verticality of the Stuka's dive was too perfect. The plane's design and engineering were well suited to resisting the forces involved in dive bombing. The human body was less well equipped to deal with these forces. G-force, measured in Gs, is the unit used to describe acceleration and the strains it causes. The human body is capable of withstanding many Gs when applied locally. A hard slap to the face may produce hundreds of Gs at once. However, generally applied Gs, particularly vertical Gs, are a big problem. Vertical Gs force blood away from the head towards the feet. The problems this can cause fighter pilots are far worse than any slap. As blood is drained from the head, the brain is starved of oxygen. This causes key neurological functions, such as vision and consciousness, to shut down as a protective response. At less than 4G, no visual problems or loss of consciousness were experienced. It was discovered that the highest load a pilot could endure was 8.5G for 3 seconds, when the aircraft was pushed to its limits. This was the upper limit though. At 6G, 50% of pilots suffered visual problems, or grey out. From 7.5G upwards, some 40% of pilots' vision vanished altogether, with some even blacking out. Isn't it just incredible to imagine? Strapped into a warplane, hurtling towards hostile enemy positions on the ground, potentially equipped with anti-air cannons, pilots surrounded by the screams of their own aircraft and the thunderous bellow of war. On the dive, they hurtled towards targets at 60 to 90 degrees, plummeting at 350 to 370 miles an hour. They would tense up, straining all their muscles to try and keep the blood from rushing out of their head, desperate not to pass out. The pilots of the Ju-87 were rightly held in awe by their comrades in arms. Heroic or mad? Well, most were considered to be a little bit of both. Across the war, new technologies were adapted to reduce the effects of G and the danger of dive bombing. The pressurized cabin was of great importance during this research, and the Ju-87 was one of the first aircraft to take advantage of this vital new technology. Air brakes under each wing stopped the plane from reaching too high a speed during dive runs, also reducing the Gs experienced. Finally, an innovative automatic pull-up mechanism was created. Upon the release of the bomb, the Stuka would level out, ending the dive. This turned out to be a life-saving adaptation. Pilots who began to black out were still in control of their bodies and could continue to operate their controls for around 3 seconds before losing consciousness. In this precious window of time, they could line up with their target and release the bomb, safe in the knowledge that if they lost control, they would not plunge themselves into the target. Before this brilliant hydraulic operation was conceived, only the most experienced and physically fit pilots could muster the strength to pull the plane up and save their lives. As you can begin to understand, the Ju-87 was rightly viewed with awe by its pilots. However, any fear pilots might have had paled in comparison when compared to how terrified those same targets on the ground felt. The scene of battle is never a calm place, least of all during an air attack. But an air attack by the Ju-87 dive bomber was especially horrific. Not only did this plane plunge directly towards its targets, but it emitted a howling scream as it did so. The horns fitted were known as Jericho horns, a biblical reference. In the book of Joshua, Joshua, leader of the Israelites, was attacking a city. His priests blew the horns, and the walls of the city were destroyed before every man, woman, and child was put to death. Like those biblical horns, the horns fitted to the Stuka were the prelude to death and ruin. If you'll permit an old Tolkien fan a moment of fancy, doesn't it just remind you of the shrieks of the winged Nazgul bearing down on the soldiers in Lord of the Rings, causing them to lose their minds with fear? That's the image I get. These terrifying propeller-driven sirens were used to weaken enemy morale, heightening the intimidation of dive bombing. As one soldier said, quote, "The Stuka was more than a bomber. It was an instrument of fear." I mean, just listen to this thing dive. Another adaptation first employed by the Stuka were whistling bombs. Anyone who has watched a movie about the Second World War produced in Hollywood might be mistaken for thinking all bombs whistle in their descent. In fact, it was the bombs of the Stuka, fitted with a kind of whistle on their fins, that first created this terrifying noise, robbing Hollywood directors of their hearts and combat troops of their nerves. You'll recognize the noise, but here it is in full authenticity. The whistling death of the Stuka. If the end of the world had a noise, well, I bet it sounds a little like that. This focus on fear as a weapon of war was not a casual one. The most effective victories involved not grueling fights to the death, but routs and encirclements. If the enemy was convinced they were fighting overwhelming odds, they might put down their weapons and either surrender or flee. This provided one tenet of blitzkrieg tactics: create the impression of overwhelming force to break an enemy's resolve. The Ju-87 was a fundamental piece in this psychological warfare. But, of course, psychological warfare alone wouldn't cut it. The Ju-87 ensured that those it attacked were more than just scared. Sporting 2 wing-mounted machine guns along with a third gun installed in the rear cockpit, the Stuka could perform strafing attacks and present a measured threat to other fighting aircraft. Typically, the early Stukas carried either one 500-pound class bomb or one 250-pound bomb on the centerline bomb crutch, as well as 2 50-pound bombs on each wing. Often these smaller bombs were filled with cluster-type munitions, devastating to exposed infantry. Later Stuka models were equipped with a 37mm cannon for low-altitude attacks on tanks on the Eastern Front. Another variant, the Ju-87R, had under-wing fuel tanks, so it could extend its range and reach out to strike Allied ships at sea. As is clear from these changes in armament, as the war progressed, so too did the use of the Stuka. Seen as outdated and in need of replacement before the war, this mighty machine still somehow remained in service for all 5.5 years of the war, devastating Allied and Communist forces throughout. That devastation wasn't easily achieved. Even in 1939, during the war in Poland, the slow-moving Junkers Ju-87 suffered losses when it lacked fighter protection. RAF Air Marshal Arthur Tedder said, quote, "Our fighter pilots weep for joy when they see Stukas." And as the war progressed and the Allies began to achieve air superiority, the Stuka seemed increasingly ineffective. A brief stint attacking shipping around occupied Norway saw large casualties at the hands of British fighters. They then received a beating during the Battle of Britain. Many German pilots feared assignments in or even near these planes, calling them fighter magnets. Certainly, by the end of the war, the Ju-87 received many losses against more modern, faster, and better supported Allied forces. The British declared the Stuka outdated and ineffective, finished as an offensive weapon. That said, despite the outdated capabilities, the Stuka remained highly effective and, periodically, devastating, right up to 1945 and the end of the war. During the Battle of France, the plane was noted, as we've already discussed, for being able to provide pinpoint accuracy, breaking up French forces in the heat of battle and scattering reinforcements. It destroyed many Allied ships fleeing to Britain from the beaches of Dunkirk. It proved a wolf among sheep when encountering merchant shipping. As one Stuka pilot said, quote, "There was very little chance for any merchant ship of any size when attacked by a Stuka." At the very same moment the British were declaring the irrelevancy of the Ju-87 in 1940, it was terrorizing shipping in the Mediterranean, ensuring Nazi domination over Yugoslavia and Greece. The true test of the Stuka was Nazi Germany's greatest war, the war in the East. As the two titans, Nazi Germany and the USSR, clashed in Eastern Europe, the Stuka played a prominent role in crippling the USSR's air power. It bombed planes on their runways, destroying thousands. It crippled counterattacking Soviet armor. It neutralized strongpoints and disrupted supply lines. On the 5th of July 1941, a squadron of Stukas destroyed 18 train cars and 500 vehicles. Across the war, the top 58 Stuka pilots destroyed some 3,700 Soviet tanks, a startling success rate. However, by 1944, the Soviets were building that many new T-34s each month. The Stuka may have been effective, but the war would not turn in Germany's favour, and the long retreat to Berlin soon began. Even as all turned against the Germans, with the Russians sieging Berlin itself, and with Hitler's empire crumbling around him, the Ju-87 proved its worth. With the Red Army advancing faster than its air support, the Luftwaffe again took to the skies. The Ju-87 would have one last moment of heroic victory. In scenes reminiscent of the devastation caused in 1941, the Stuka dive bombers plunged upon Soviet positions unopposed. Within 3 days, they had destroyed 2,000 vehicles and 51 tanks. Tellingly, as German supply lines were cut off and everything from food to bullets ran in short supply, some of the last supplies of fuel left were reserved for use by the Ju-87. This machine, outdated even in 1939, had triumphed in the field of battle time after time, inspiring German troops and terrifying enemy forces wherever it flew. The Ju-87 and its pilots fought for the Nazi regime, an evil empire with genocidal ambitions. Every success it had in the field of battle, and there were many, brought Hitler's twisted dream one step closer to reality. The Stuka did not serve a worthy goal. But the achievements of this plucky plane were incredible. Ugly, slow-moving, and piloted by some of aerospace's bravest or craziest pilots, the Stuka overcame incredible odds, exceeding expectations at each and every turn. With its screaming horns, whistling bombs, crazed dives, and cruelly effective combat record, the Stuka has cemented its place in history. With its iconic appearance and ability to inflict high losses, the Ju-87 remains an icon to this day, a lesson in the tactics of terror and the effectiveness of combined arms tactics. And there you have the Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber. Please leave a comment down below, and remember to like this video and subscribe to support the channel. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.